Montana Territory, November 1883. The most respected livestock man in Beaverhead County stood outside a limestone cave entrance, shaking his head. "This," he said loud enough for the gathered homesteaders to hear, "is the most dangerous thing I've seen a settler attempt." Inside that cave, a woman named Sarah Hendricks was building what everyone called impossible, a winter stable carved into the mountain itself. Today, you're going to understand why the worst idea became the most copied livestock strategy in the region, and why modern ranchers are rediscovering what Sarah knew in 1883. If you want to receive a proven frontier technique every week, methods that worked when survival actually depended on them, hit that subscribe button right now. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, because this story crosses continents. Let's go back to that November day when mockery was about to meet mathematics. Sarah Hendricks arrived in Beaverhead County in the spring of 1882 with her husband, 2 horses for milk cows, and a small herd of sheep. By her second winter, her husband was dead from pneumonia, and she was running the homestead alone at 41 years old. The standard method in the region was clear: build a timber frame barn, chink the gaps with mud and moss, stack hay bales against the north wall for insulation, and pray the livestock survived until April. Every rancher followed the same blueprint. Every winter, the same problems appeared. Barn walls cracked in the cold. Wind found every gap. Temperatures inside the structures barely rose above outside readings. Feeding troughs froze solid. Water had to be brought in twice daily and often froze before the animals finished drinking. Newborn calves and lambs died within hours. Feed consumption doubled because animals burned energy just staying warm. Ranchers lost 15 to 30% of their stock every winter, and everyone accepted it as the cost of mountain living. Sarah's first winter nearly bankrupted her. 3 sheep dead, 1 calf lost. Her 2 horses dropped weight so severely she thought she'd lose them both. She burned through her entire woodpile by February and had to barter labor for more. The barn she'd inherited was standard construction, and it was killing her animals as efficiently as the open range. By March 1883, Sarah had made a decision that would make her either a legend or a cautionary tale. A quarter mile from her cabin, a limestone ridge rose 30 feet above the valley floor. Erosion had carved a natural cavity roughly 12 feet deep, 20 feet wide, and 9 feet tall at the entrance. Local hunters used it occasionally for shelter. Sarah saw something else, a solution the entire region was ignoring: geothermal stability, constant temperature, natural wind protection, structural integrity that no timber frame could match. She didn't have the vocabulary for it, but she understood the principle. The earth itself was a heat battery, and she was going to let it do the work. She began hauling tools to the cave in April. By May, neighbors started noticing. By June, the criticism had begun. "You're wasting time on a hole in the ground," one rancher told her flatly. "That cave will trap moisture, rot your feed, and suffocate your stock." Sarah kept digging. She had 6 months until the cold returned, and she had no intention of losing another animal to a failed system. Sarah's plan was specific, methodical, and, according to every experienced builder in the county, dangerously ignorant. She widened the cave entrance to 16 feet, creating a throat that funneled air inward but prevented wind from blasting straight through. She carved a shallow trench along the cave floor to channel meltwater and seepage away from the livestock area. She built a low stone wall 18 inches high just inside the entrance, forming a thermal barrier that cold air would have to climb over, letting the heaviest cold sink and flow back outside. The rear section of the cave, where the ceiling dropped to 7 feet, became the feed storage area. Hay bales stacked to the ceiling. Grain bins wedged into natural alcoves in the limestone. The middle section, where headroom was greatest, became the animal enclosure, space for 8 to 10 head, with tie points carved directly into the stone walls. For ventilation, she chiseled 2 narrow shafts near the cave ceiling, angling them upward and back toward natural fissures in the ridge. Warm air, being lighter, would rise and escape. Fresh air would enter low, across the stone barrier, replacing what left. No draft, No wind, just slow, steady circulation. The cave maintained a near-constant temperature year-round, roughly 45 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit, because limestone, 20 feet deep, doesn't care what the surface is doing. It holds the average annual ground temperature of the region. While outside air could swing 60 degrees in a day, the cave would barely move 5. She reinforced the entrance with salvaged timber, not to hold up the cave. It had stood for thousands of years, but to create a double-door system. Outer door, rough plank, hung on iron hinges. Inner door, canvas and wool layered over a wooden frame. The airspace between them added another thermal buffer. Total material cost, $40 in hinges, nails, and canvas. Total labor, 4 months of solo work, mostly widening, leveling, and improving drainage. Now came the part that made experienced ranchers shake their heads. Sarah planned to keep her animals in that cave from November through March. No pasture rotation, no open-air exercise, just stone, darkness, and stored feed. "It's a tomb," said Franklin Graves, a livestock dealer who'd been running cattle in Montana for 12 years. "You put animals in a cave, they'll suffocate, panic, or starve. Livestock need air, light, and movement. This isn't husbandry, it's cruelty." The county's most experienced builder, a man named Howard Pitts, was even blunter. "That cave will sweat. Moisture will condensate on the walls, soak the hay, rot the feed, and breed sickness. You'll lose everything by January, and you'll have no one to blame but yourself." Even the women in the valley, who generally supported each other in the harsh conditions, thought Sarah had lost her grip. "A barn can be repaired," one neighbor told her. "A cave can't. If it collapses, you're done. If it floods, you're done. You're risking everything on stone that doesn't care if you live or die." The social judgment went deeper. A proper rancher built a proper barn. That was the mark of civilization, of progress, of a homesteader who meant to stay. Using a cave felt like retreat, like failure, like admitting you couldn't do it the right way, so you were hiding in the ground like an animal. Sarah didn't argue. She didn't defend. She just kept working, and by October 1883, the cave stable was ready. The confrontation came on a cold Saturday in early November, 3 weeks before the first major snowfall. Franklin Graves rode out to Sarah's homestead with 2 other ranchers, ostensibly to check on the widow Hendricks. They found her moving hay bales into the cave, her horses already stabled inside. Graves dismounted, walked to the cave entrance, looked inside, and turned back with his jaw set. "Sarah, I'm saying this in front of witnesses because I want on record. What you're doing here is reckless. You're going to kill your stock, and when you do, people are going to remember that we tried to stop you." One of the other ranchers, a man named Cyrus Milford, nodded. "This isn't a stable. It's a trap. Animals need daylight. They need fresh air. You've got them pinned in stone with no way out if something goes wrong. What happens when that ceiling cracks?" Graves continued. "What happens when spring melt floods that trench? What happens when your ventilation shafts freeze shut and those animals suffocate in their own breath?" Sarah stood at the entrance, hands on her hips, and said nothing. "You're not a rancher," Graves said, his voice dropping. "You're a woman trying to do a man's job with a fool's method. If you had any sense, you'd sell this place, move to town, and let someone who knows livestock take over before you embarrass yourself further." That last line landed hard. It wasn't just about the cave anymore. It was about her right to be there at all. One of the ranchers muttered, "A real man would have built a barn." Sarah looked at him, then at Graves, then back at the cave entrance. Her voice, when it came, was quiet and factual. "I've done the math. I've tested the airflow. I've measured the temperature. And I've made my decision. You're welcome to check back in spring and see who was right." Graves shook his head. "We will, and I'll be the first to say I told you so." They rode off, and Sarah went back to stacking hay. Word spread quickly. By mid-November, Sarah's cave stable was the joke of Beaverhead County. At the general store, men laughed about the widow's cave. At church, women whispered that Sarah had lost her nerve. Even the few who thought she might be onto something stayed quiet, because defending her meant defending an idea that looked insane. The mockery had a sharper edge than most frontier gossip. Sarah wasn't just trying something unconventional. She was implying that the accepted method was wrong. That men who'd ranched for decades didn't understand thermodynamics. That tradition wasn't wisdom, it was just repetition. No one likes being told they've been doing it wrong. So when the calendar turned to December and the temperatures started dropping, everyone in the valley was watching Sarah Hendricks' homestead. Not because they wanted her to succeed, because they wanted to be there when she failed. December 1883 started cold and got colder. By the second week, daytime highs were holding at 10 degrees Fahrenheit. Nighttime lows were dropping to minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit. Snowfall was steady but not catastrophic yet. Ranchers began the familiar routine, breaking ice on water troughs, hauling extra feed, checking barn walls for new cracks, burning through firewood to keep their own homes livable. Sarah's routine was different. She checked her animals twice a day, morning and evening. She hauled water once in the morning, and it stayed liquid all day. She fed from a stored hay in the back of the cave. She noted the interior temperature on a simple mercury thermometer she'd hung from a support beam. 46 degrees Fahrenheit in the morning, 48 degrees Fahrenheit in the evening. Outside, the air was killing cold. Inside the cave, her livestock stood calm, dry, and warm enough that their breath barely condensed. Then January arrived, and winter stopped pretending. On January 9th, 1884, a blizzard rolled down from Canada with winds clocked at 40 miles per hour and temperatures that made grown men weep. The storm lasted 4 days. Snowdrifts buried fences. Barn doors froze shut. Livestock huddled in corners, shivering so hard their bones rattled. The temperature dropped to minus 28 degrees Fahrenheit, then minus 31 degrees Fahrenheit. Then, on the night of January 12th, it bottomed out at minus 37 degrees Fahrenheit. Ranchers all over Beaverhead County fought to keep their animals alive. They stuffed blankets in barn gaps. They burned precious hay just for warmth. They slaughtered animals they knew wouldn't make it, rather than watch them freeze. Franklin Graves lost 11 head of cattle in 2 nights. Cyrus Milford's barn wall split in the cold, and he spent 6 hours in sub-zero wind trying to patch it with frozen hands. At Sarah Hendricks' cave, the temperature inside held at 44 degrees Fahrenheit. The stone didn't care about the wind. The earth didn't feel the cold. 20 feet of limestone stood between her animals and the killing air, and the geothermal mass did exactly what she calculated. It absorbed the cold, diffused it, and gave back nothing but steady, survivable warmth. Her horses stood quietly. Her cows chewed cud. Her sheep slept in piles, dry and calm. On the morning of January 13th, when the storm finally broke, Sarah walked outside into a world that looked like the surface of a dead planet. The valley was white, silent, and crusted with ice. Smoke rose from chimneys across the basin, thin, desperate columns from homesteads burning everything they had. She walked back in the cave, checked the thermometer, and wrote the number in her ledger, 43 degrees Fahrenheit. Her animals hadn't even noticed the worst cold snap in a decade. Now, stay with me, because when the neighbors finally came to check on the widow's disaster, the numbers they found humiliated every assumption they'd made. And if you want to see how this one winter changed ranching in Montana for the next 40 years, hit that like button right now and drop a comment with the coldest temperature you've ever faced. I want to know where my audience is coming from and what you survived. Let's finish this story. The first person to visit Sarah's homestead after the blizzard was her nearest neighbor, a woman named Catherine Dorsey, who lived 2 miles east. Catherine had lost 3 chickens and a goat to the cold, and she'd spent the storm in genuine fear that her own children might freeze if the fire went out. She arrived on horseback, mid-morning, expecting to find disaster. Instead, she found Sarah hauling water to the cave, her animals visible through the open entrance, standing calm and healthy in the dim interior light. Catherine dismounted, walked to the cave mouth, and stopped cold. "Sarah, how warm is it in there?" Sarah glanced at the thermometer. 43 degrees. Catherine blinked. 43, during a minus 37 degrees night. The coldest it's dropped all winter was 41 degrees. That was 2 weeks ago, during the first cold snap. Catherine stepped inside. The air was cool, yes, but it was still breathable, dry enough that the hay smelled fresh, not moldy. The animals looked better than her own stock had looked before the storm. "How much feed are you going through?" Sarah pulled her ledger from a shelf carved into the stone. "I'm averaging 12 pounds of hay per head per day. My horses are holding weight. The cows are producing milk. I haven't lost a single animal." Catherine did the math in her head. 12 pounds per head. Her own barn animals were eating 18 to 20 pounds per day just to maintain body heat in the cold. Sarah's animals were eating a third less and looked healthier. "What about water?" "I haul once a day. 43 degrees is above freezing. It stays liquid." Catherine stood there for a long moment, then walked back outside. She mounted her horse, looked down at Sarah, and said, "You need to tell people about this." "People already know," Sarah replied. "They just don't believe it yet." By the end of January, word had spread, not through Sarah, but through neighbors who'd started asking questions. Franklin Graves, who'd been the loudest critic, rode out himself on February 2nd with a thermometer and a notebook. Sarah let him in without a word. Graves walked the length of the cave, checked the ventilation shafts, examined the drainage trench, and stood in the animal enclosure for 5 full minutes, watching the livestock. He hung his own thermometer next to Sarah's. Both read 45 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside, the air was 8 degrees Fahrenheit. He opened his notebook and started writing. "How much hay have you used since November?" 870 pounds total as of this morning. That's for 2 horses, 4 cows, and 9 sheep. Graves did the calculation. In a standard barn, that same number of animals would have consumed over 1,400 pounds by now, and half of them would likely be dead or dying. Water, 1 trip per day, 30 gallons. Doesn't freeze. Feed cost, 40% less than last winter. No losses to freezing, spoilage, or illness. Graves looked at her. "Your animals are healthier than mine." "Yes. You've burned no firewood for the stable. The earth does the work." Graves closed his notebook. His voice, when he spoke, had lost its edge. "I told you this was dangerous." "You did. I was wrong." Sarah nodded. "You were." Graves left, and within a week, 3 ranchers had asked Sarah if they could examine her setup. By mid-February, a man named Joseph Keller had started carving his own cave stable into a sandstone ridge 5 miles north. By March, 2 more were in progress. The numbers were irrefutable. Sarah's cave stable versus standard barn construction. Winter 1883 to 84 interior temperature stability. 41 to 48 degrees Fahrenheit in cave versus minus 10 degrees to 20 degrees Fahrenheit in timber barns feed consumption. 12 pounds per head per day versus 18 to 20 lbs/head/day livestock mortality. 0% versus 15 to 30% regional average water delivery. Once daily, no freezing versus twice daily. Constant ice management structural maintenance during winter. 0 versus constant chinking, patching, and repair fuel costs for heating. 0 versus significant firewood consumption overall feed cost reduction. 40% compared to previous winter when spring arrived and the snow melted. Sarah's animals walked out of that cave in better condition than they'd entered. Her horses had maintained weight. Her cows were pregnant. Her sheepswool was thick and clean. Across the valley, ranchers were counting dead animals, tallying losses, and trying to explain to their families why this winter had been so brutal. Sarah Hendricks had lost nothing. The technique she'd been mocked for had outperformed every traditional method in the county, and the proof wasn't a theory. It was walking, breathing, and healthy. The shift didn't happen overnight, but it happened. Franklin Graves was the first to publicly reverse his position. At a community meeting in late March 1884, he stood in front of 24 ranchers and said flat out, "I was wrong about Sarah Hendricks' cave stable. I've seen the numbers. I've checked the setup. It works better than anything we're doing, and we'd be fools not to learn from it." That admission carried weight. Graves wasn't a man given to apologies or self-doubt. If he was willing to say he'd been wrong, others started reconsidering their own assumptions. Howard Pitts, the builder who'd predicted moisture rot and structural failure, visited Sarah's cave in April. He brought a moisture meter, a level, and a deep sense of skepticism. He left 2 hours later with notes on ventilation shaft angles, drainage grades, and thermal barrier wall heights. "I've built 40 barns in this territory," he told Sarah before he left. "And not one of them would have performed like this." You weren't guessing. You were engineering. The term that started circulating wasn't cave stable, it was geothermal stable. Ranchers who adopted the method didn't call it hiding or retreating. They called it practical. By the winter of 1884 to 85, 7 homesteads in Beaverhead County had some version of Sarah's design. 3 were full cave conversions. 4 were hybrid systems, timber barns built against limestone ridges, with the back wall carved into stone to provide thermal mass and wind protection. By 1886, the technique had spread to adjacent counties. A territorial agriculture report from that year noted increased use of earth-sheltered livestock housing in southwestern Montana, with marked improvements in winter survival rates and feed efficiency. The innovation didn't stop at caves. Ranchers began experimenting with dugout barns, partially buried structures, and stone-backed enclosures, all variations on the same principle Sarah had proven. The earth is a better insulator than anything humans can build on top of it. The social reversal was quieter, but just as significant. Sarah Hendricks was no longer the widow trying to do a man's job. She was the woman who'd figured out what the experts had missed. When new homesteaders arrived in the valley, they were told, "If you're serious about surviving winter, go talk to Sarah." She didn't become wealthy. She didn't patent the method. She just kept ranching, kept refining her setup, and kept her animals alive through winters that killed stock all over the territory. In 1889, a journalist from the Helena Independent visited her homestead and wrote a short piece titled "The Cave That Outlasted Tradition." The article noted that Sarah's technique had reversed the mortality curve in regions where geological formations permit adaptation. By the early 1890s, the idea had become so standard in certain areas that newcomers didn't even know it had once been controversial. It was just how you build a stable if you had access to stone and understood heat. The lesson wasn't complicated. Sarah Hendricks hadn't invented geothermal stability. The Earth had been holding temperature for 4 billion years. She'd just been the first person in Beaverhead County willing to trust it more than tradition. And when the test came, when minus 37 degrees Fahrenheit wind tried to kill everything in its path, the stone held, the animals survived, and the mockery turned to mathematics. The people who'd laughed didn't laugh anymore. They learned. And that might be the real legacy. Not the technique itself, but the willingness to abandon a failing system the moment a better one proved itself. Sarah Hendricks didn't win an argument. She won a winter. And in Montana territory, that was the only victory that mattered. Here's what Sarah Hendricks understood that most of Beaverhead County missed in 1883. Tradition isn't the same as truth. For decades, ranchers had built timber barns because that's what ranchers did. It was visible. It was familiar. It looked like progress. But visibility isn't the same as performance, and familiarity isn't the same as efficiency. Sarah didn't reject tradition out of arrogance. She rejected it because it was killing her animals and bankrupting her homestead. She looked at the problem, extreme cold, limited resources, high mortality, and asked a question most people never ask. What if the accepted solution is wrong? The cave wasn't a retreat. It was an upgrade. The earth doesn't care about wind. It doesn't react to cold snaps. It doesn't crack, warp, or rot. It just holds temperature year after year, indifferent to the chaos on the surface. Sarah didn't discover that principle. She just stopped ignoring it. And here's the part that matters today. We're still ignoring it. Modern ranching, modern building, modern survival strategy, most of it is still based on fighting the environment instead of using it. We burn energy to heat spaces that leak. We build structures that require constant maintenance. We treat the earth like an obstacle instead of an ally. Sarah's cave stable wasn't primitive. It was advanced. It required understanding thermal mass, air circulation, moisture management, and geothermal stability, concepts that most expert builders in 1883 didn't even have vocabulary for. The people who mocked her weren't stupid. They were just operating on assumptions they'd never tested. And when the test came, the assumptions failed. That's the real story here. Not that a woman built a stable in a cave. but that she was willing to be wrong about everything except the results. And the results spoke for themselves. 0 losses, 40% cost reduction, healthier animals, and a method so effective that it spread across 3 counties in under 5 years. So here's my question for you, and I want you to answer in the comments. Which part of Sarah's solution would you apply to your own situation today? Would you use geothermal mass for temperature stability? Would you prioritize function over appearance? Would you challenge an accepted method that's clearly failing? Or would you build the timber barn because that's what everyone expects? Drop your answer below. Tell me where you're watching from and what the coldest winter you've ever faced taught you about survival. And if this story made you rethink what primitive actually means, hit that like button and subscribe, because every week I bring you another technique that worked when everything else failed. The frontier didn't reward tradition. It rewarded results. Sarah Hendricks proved that in the winter of 1884, and the lesson still holds. Educational note. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. Characters, names, and specific events are fictional, while the techniques, concepts, and principles discussed are based on real historical practices and well-established physical or practical knowledge. Any modern application should be evaluated according to current standards, safety guidelines, and applicable laws or regulations. This content is educational in nature and does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.